My father loved the big white ship. He felt that it was the most beautiful thing afloat. The Seven Seas was a full... Every time we climbed the ratlins to sails, it was like meeting history head-on. We did things in the traditional way on the Seven Seas. It took muscle and hard work to sail her. The Swedes built the ship of Swedish iron in 1912 as a training vessel for cadets. She was 168 feet long, had a 27.5-foot beam, and drew a little over 2 fathoms. When all sail was set, she carried 16,000 square feet of canvas, 5 square sails on each of the 3 masts, 3 jibs, staysails, 4 middle staysails, and a spanker. Her record run was from Iceland to Gothenburg, Sweden, a little over 1,000 miles in 72 hours. That's an average of 14 knots. The Seven Seas was converted to a private yacht in 1929, and in 1936 my white-bearded father, William S. Gubelmann, bought her. We sailed her until World War II, the last full-rigged ship in American yachting. But in the early 1940s, she stopped being a pleasure craft. The Navy commandeered her and used her as a floating dormitory. She lost her elegance then. Later, there was nothing to do but sell her into the banana trade as a freighter. Luckily, the middle of her story is happier than the ending. In her heyday, the Seven Seas was a thing of grace and beauty. Ordinarily, we carried a year-round professional crew of 27, plus whatever amateur sailors and guests we had invited aboard. Changing sail while underway was often done. Here is a routine checking of our position by shooting the sun with a sextant. Those who went aloft into the rigging came down as rapidly as possible, as I'm doing here, sliding down the backstay. You let your feet slide, but you lowered yourself hand over hand to avoid rope burn. Here they're lowering a topsail from a yardarm and bending on a new topsail. Apparently we had a tear in that sail and wanted to take it below and repair it at our leisure. We handled miles of braces, clew lines, bunt lines, sheets, and halyards. Every rope was named for its function. Shortening sails was quite a production, and it could be a dangerous job. It was a long way up the ratlins every time you wanted to go aloft. Several hands had to pull on the braces in order to turn the yards. When we wanted to tack ship, we'd have to brace the yards from one side to the other. We figured our speed with an old-fashioned chip log. The piece of wood acts like a little sea anchor. As the line rolls out, we time it with a miniature hourglass. Eventually, more or less by popular demand, we decided that the Seven Seas should race the only other large full-rigged ship in America, Huntington Hartford's Joseph Conrad, which you'll see in a couple of minutes. We agreed to race from Newport to Bermuda, a distance of about 660 miles. The loser would stand the winner and his crew to a dinner, a rather more elaborate one than you see being served here to the afterguard, meaning our guests and amateur sailors. A few days at sea could create a prodigious appetite. In August of 1937, the Seven Seas and the Conrad left Newport with great fanfare. But the wind was light and fluky. For 10 days we had plenty of time for fishing as we drifted along at 2 knots. The Conrad drifted a little faster than we did and coasted into the Bermuda finish line seconds ahead of us. That race wasn't very satisfactory to anybody. We decided to race back to Newport in hope that we would be favored with a good sailing breeze. Some of the amateurs in the crew had to get back to the States in a hurry, so they took the Pan American flying boat to New York. The rest of us went to sea against the Joseph Conrad for the second time. This is the Conrad as she looked from our deck. She was a bluff-bowed ship built in Copenhagen in 1882 with a deck length of 116 feet. We carried more canvas than the Conrad and agreed to approximately a 12-hour handicap. With a good wind, our clipper bow sliced the sea with a bone in her teeth. For much of the time, we had a steady Gulf Stream breeze of 15 to 18 miles, but gusts of up to 30 brought on rough weather. We hit a storm lasting 3 days and lost some deck fittings in the rushing seas. Gradually, we overtook the smaller Conrad. It was probably the only race in history between privately owned square riggers. The Conrad eventually sagged off to the east and ended up off Nova Scotia. On September 20th, 7 days out of Bermuda, the Seven Seas entered Newport Harbor. The Conrad straggled into port 3 days later. This race was another reminder of how the elements dominate the deep water sailor. Gale force winds send men aloft to fight the canvas while the helmsman battles the seas to control the ship. But with skill and a degree of luck, you reach home and a snug harbor. Most of the time, of course, the Seven Seas was given over to pleasure cruising, with the professional crew doing most of the work. The chef and his helper came on deck to watch occasionally. Some of the older friends of my father enjoyed the yacht, even when the water wasn't the smoothest. Such people as Mr. Colgate Hoyt were very good sailors. Everybody pitched in. The guests liked to get the feel of the ship, which also meant getting their sea legs. There's Percy Weeks at the helm, steering us toward Bermuda. That's the late Vale Stebbins helping to set up on a line. Some of the older guests were alive when ships of the same type as the Seven Seas had raced to China in the tea trade or carried passengers to the gold rushes of Alaska and Australia or brought nitrates from Chile. The crew is tacking down a foresail here, way out at the end of the cathead. leading it a little farther forward so we can put the ship closer to the wind. We're close hauled on the port tack now, going along nicely with a bit more sail on. The captain and mate taking a sunline. As you might expect, the afterguard didn't spend all of its time sailing the ship. They rested a good deal and just took the salt air and looked very nautical doing it. Ships like the Seven Seas were at home in a heavy sea. The old commercial clippers, for instance, sometimes ran more wet than dry, with the helmsman lashed to the wheel to keep him from being washed overboard, a situation that was a bit more rugged than this one. The guests seemed to thrive, no matter what the weather. My father loved the sea. He was 77 on this cruise. He continued to sail occasionally until well into his 80s. There were thousands of feet of line required to operate the ship, and you had to know your ropes or get lost in them. We carried 2 launches in addition to standard lifeboats. Fortunately, we never had to use the lifeboats in an emergency, despite some harrowing experiences. There were many, many cruises, but I never tired of watching the men climbing in the rigging. When aloft, an old sailing adage applied: 1 hand for the ship, 1 for yourself, and hang on tight. The Seven Seas wasn't always a strictly masculine world. Ladies would come aboard, and we'd find them in the most unlikely places. Here's my wife, for instance, up on the top of the mizzenmast with young Alfie Roosevelt. That's a long way up and a long way down. This is in 1938, a year after our race with the Joseph Conrad. My wife, whose name was then Barton Green, and some friends came aboard to watch the regular yachts in their biennial race from Newport to Bermuda. Quite a group of us were looking on as the race got underway. When we put out to sea ourselves, the crew got a line to the anchor to pull it in, and then hoisted it up with a tackle and secured it to the cathead. We followed the fleet all the way to Bermuda that summer, just for the sport. There weren't any square riggers in the race, of course, which in a way was too bad because we had better winds than we had in the 37 contest with the Conrad. Our sails were drawing well. Sometimes I even took a picture of someone besides my wife. This is Miggy Willamaz. This kind of lounging around wouldn't have been quite so pleasant in the famous old days of sail a century ago. Then the square riggers carried livestock on deck for a fresh food supply. There was water everywhere, but we decided not to drink it. days of sun, sea, and salt air, there sometimes were hijinks in the rigging. Not exactly proper seamanship, but it showed our happy spirits. That's the way life went aboard the big square rigger. We raced and we played in a way that only the seven seas made possible. I guess times will never be quite the same again.